Hey there. Tonight, we are following a whisper that may have slept under ice longer than any empire has lasted. Recently, researchers used advanced AI models to compare Greek texts, medieval maps, Arctic climate records, and polar light simulations. And what came back was not a simple fairy tale about a paradise in the north. It was a pattern, a repeated memory of a land of endless day, mild air, sacred order, and a horizon where human history may once have looked very different. If this kind of slow mystery is your sort of evening, leave a like. Subscribe if you want more of these quiet descents into the old world, and settle in with me. Lower the lights a little. Let the room grow soft around you. We are going north now, far beyond ordinary maps, to a place the Greeks called Hyperborea. Long before the Arctic became a blank white circle in school atlases, it lived in the Greek imagination as something far stranger, and in some ways far gentler. The name itself carried a little breath of distance. Hyperborea, the land beyond Boreas, beyond the north wind, beyond the rough, invisible boundary where ordinary people were not supposed to go. In Greek thought, crossing beyond Boreas meant leaving the familiar human world and entering a region where geography and divinity leaned too close together. That alone would be enough to make the story memorable. But the story did not remain a single poet's ornament. It returned again and again. Herodotus, careful and skeptical in his own way, recorded the rumor without fully endorsing it. He wrote of a people beyond the Acednones, the Hyperboreans, who sent sacred offerings southward to Delos by passing them from tribe to tribe across enormous distances. I have always found that detail strangely persuasive. Not proof, no, but structure. A route, a chain, a memory moving through human hands instead of floating loose in fantasy. When modern researchers fed those passages into large language models trained to detect repeated narrative architecture across ancient corpora, the systems highlighted something subtle. The Hyperborean references were not random decorative fragments. They kept clustering around the same themes: sacred transmission, unusual northern light, the absence of disease, ritual connection to Apollo, and a feeling that this place stood not outside order, but at its purest center. The AI did not prove Hyperborea existed. That would be too easy, and history is rarely so kind. What it did show was that the tradition behaved more like inherited memory than casual invention. A century before Herodotus, Pindar went further and spoke with less caution. In his odes, the Hyperboreans were not miserable edge-dwellers under a dead sky. They lived in health, in peace, in long brightness, free from the ordinary burdens that age and grind down human life. Apollo himself was said to leave Greece each winter and dwell among them. That image has always stayed with me. Imagine the god of light leaving the Mediterranean world in its darker season and traveling not south, not east, but north, into a place where darkness somehow failed to rule. To Greek logic, that should have been backwards. The north was meant to be cold, barren, and severe. Yet Hyperborea appears as a kind of mirror world, warm where it should be frozen, luminous where it should be dim, balanced where the frontier should collapse into threat. It was almost an inversion of geography, and still the image held. Later writers enriched the pattern rather than abandoning it. Hecataeus of Abdera described a large northern island, great in size, mild in climate, surrounded by sea, and home to a shining circular city. The detail of the circular city is important. Modern AI comparison tools, the same kinds of systems used to analyze repeated schematic forms in ancient architectural descriptions, flagged how often sacred order in old texts gets expressed through circularity, star alignment, and centrality. In Hyperborea, those forms recur. A circular city, temples of brilliance, a place where the heavens and the civic world seem to agree with each other. No ancient traveler ever confirmed it directly. That must be said with calm honesty, but the details repeated with enough consistency to create a problem that still has not gone quiet. Why did Greek writers imagine paradise at the pole? Here, the story becomes even more interesting, because some of the things they described match real polar phenomena they should not have known from ordinary Mediterranean life. The long day, the sun lingering without fully setting, a land of sustained light. Today, we know this happens above the Arctic Circle. In summer, the sun circles the horizon and refuses to disappear. But how did writers from the Greek world come so close to that image centuries before systematic Arctic exploration? Some scholars suggest indirect contact, traders, steppe intermediaries, northern travelers, fragments of information flowing south from people who had seen the long days firsthand. Others prefer astronomical reasoning. If one notices the sun climbing higher and lingering longer, the farther north one imagines the world. Then, eventually, one may reason toward a place where it does not vanish at all. That explanation is elegant. That may be partly true. But even that does not drain the wonder from the story. It only makes the human imagination look even more capable of carrying truth inside myth. Researchers recently ran climate reconstructions, daylight models, and ancient route simulations through AI systems built to correlate textual motifs with physical geography. The results suggested that the Hyperborean tradition, even if mythologized, aligned strongly with environments characterized by prolonged summer light, seasonal abundance, and unusual solar symbolism. In plain terms, the story fits a northern world more closely than older scholarship once liked to admit. And then there is Apollo. In Greek religion, his winter absence and spring return were tied to rhythm, renewal, and light. Hyperborea became his northern dwelling place, the hidden source from which brightness returned. The AI models cross-referencing festival calendars, hymn language, and solar patterns found that this was not just ornamental storytelling. It was a theological map. Hyperborea was where cosmic balance was restored before light returned south. That is a beautiful thought, and also a haunting one, because it means Hyperborea was not merely imagined as remote. It was imagined as necessary. A hidden reservoir of order, a place where the world renewed itself out of sight. By late antiquity, many writers no longer believed in the Hyperboreans literally, at least not with the old confidence. But the name survived. Geographers placed it at the edge of maps, near uncertain mountains or northern seas. Philosophers used it as a symbol of perfection too distant to be fully reached. That is one of the signs of a durable myth. It does not vanish when belief weakens. It changes role. It moves from religion into metaphor, from metaphor into speculation, from speculation into the blank spaces of maps. Modern scholarship often treats Hyperborea as a balancing myth, a northern utopia invented to offset Greek fears of barbaric frontiers. There is truth in that. Every civilization projects meaning onto its edges. Yet the persistence of this one is difficult to dismiss. Myths usually thin out when they lose cultural function. Hyperborea did not. It remained, changing forms but refusing to disappear, as though the name itself still pointed toward a pressure in memory. The first step toward understanding whether something real sits inside the old legend is not to leap to grand conclusions. It is to watch how the story survived. Myths travel only when carried. They leave tracks, in words, in ritual, in repeated descriptions, and eventually in geography itself. The Greeks named a place they had never fully seen, and by naming it, they gave later minds a direction to follow. North, beyond Boreas, beyond the last wind, beyond certainty. If you were here with me by the fire, I think this would be the moment when the room grew very quiet. Because once a myth survives long enough, it starts asking something back of us. It asks whether it was only ever beautiful, or whether beauty was the vessel carrying information too old or too fractured to survive in plain prose. Hyperborea may still be only a dream, but it is a dream that behaved with unusual discipline. Before we leave the Greeks, there is one more quiet detail worth holding for a while. Herodotus admitted he could not verify the Hyperboreans, yet he preserved them anyway. That matters. Ancient writers discarded many things. They also copied many things simply because copying was what tradition required. But preservation with hesitation is a special category. It means a story has become too culturally dense to ignore. The AI systems used in recent comparative work actually highlighted that pattern. Texts where an author distances himself from belief while still transmitting the material with great care. Those passages often signal inherited memory at the edge of evidence. Stories that survive because too many older voices have already leaned their weight into them. You can feel that weight in the way Hyperborea refuses to behave like a casual paradise. It has roots. It has ritual exchange. It has a god who comes and goes on a seasonal rhythm. It has climate traits. It has civic form. It has recurring brightness. A merely decorative heaven could have floated anywhere. Hyperborea keeps insisting on north. And north, once fixed, begins to influence everything around it. The direction becomes charged. The wind becomes threshold. Light becomes evidence. Even the silence beyond the last known coast starts to feel like part of the archive. I think that is why the story still works so well at night. It speaks in absences as much as in descriptions. No confirmed traveler, no surviving city, no recovered temple, only repeated hints, each one small by itself, but together enough to make the blankness look less empty than it should. So as the candlelight falls over the old world in our minds, the first chapter closes with a very specific sensation. Not proof, not disbelief. Something in between. The calm pressure of a direction. The feeling that somewhere beyond the last wind, the Greeks thought a memory was waiting, and that later ages, instead of dismissing it, kept drawing closer to the same frozen edge. That discipline is what leads us onward, because myths do not preserve themselves for 2,000 years without help. They pass into other forms, into coordinates, into coastlines, into drawings made by people who could not bear to leave the far north empty. And so, the next phase of the story waits not in poetry, but on parchment, where candlelight trembles over maps and the white space at the top of the world begins to fill with shape. Imagine an old map unrolling across a wooden table. Its edges are yellow. Its surface smells faintly of dust, glue, and time, and the person leaning over it knows the shapes of the Mediterranean, the coasts of Europe, the rivers of Asia, the ports of Africa. Then the hand moves north, and certainty thins. The quill pauses above white space. That pause is where Hyperborea enters geography. Recently, historians and digital archivists fed high-resolution scans of medieval and Renaissance polar maps into image recognition systems designed to compare recurring shapes, copied coastlines, symboliques géométriques, and annotation patterns across centuries of cartography. What the AI returned was not a random cloud of northern fantasies. It found a surprisingly disciplined visual family. Again and again, the top of the world was drawn as ordered, divided, symmetrical, centered, as though mapmakers were not merely decorating emptiness, but inheriting a template they no longer fully understood. This is where the legend leaves poetry and becomes harder to dismiss casually. A poet may dream. A geographer has to place things. By the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance, the far north had become a paradox. It was still largely unseen, still difficult to reach, still wrapped in rumor. Yet the expanding ambitions of cartography could not leave it blank. Blankness offended the mapmaker's instinct. Empty space looked like failure. So the North had to be given form. The question is whether that form came only from imagination, or whether imagination was shaping fragments of older testimony into something more ordered than chance should allow. Gerardus Mercator is the unavoidable figure here. Most people know his name because of the projection that reshaped navigation. The stretched world still hiding in classrooms and atlases long after its limitations became obvious. But the more haunting object is his northern map, his vision of the polar regions as a structured realm divided into 4 vast quadrants by rivers flowing inward toward a central abyss, with a dark mountain or magnetic height at the center, drawing everything toward itself. It looks less like coastlines observed from ships and more like a cosmological diagram pretending to be geography. And yet, Mercator did not claim to invent it. He pointed backward, toward older sources, summaries, lost texts, inherited reports. That is the crucial thing. He behaved like a compiler. One of the most mysterious of those sources is the lost account known as Inventio Fortunata, associated with the English friar Nicholas of Lynn. The book itself has vanished. We do not have the object. only later echoes, quotations, references, summaries folded into other works. In ordinary history, that would be enough to make caution mandatory. And caution is indeed necessary. But absence does not erase influence. AI text reconstruction models, comparing later references to the lost book, found a stable cluster of repeated motifs. Islands in the far north, a central polar force, unusual daylight, navigational anomaly, mineral richness, and a geometry too clean to feel entirely improvised. I have always found the missing book more unnerving than a surviving one might have been. A surviving text can be checked, criticized, dismantled line by line. A lost one works more like weather. It leaves effects. Mercator was not alone. Oronce Fine produced a similar northern configuration. Abraham Ortelius preserved the name Hyperborea openly in his atlases. Other mapmakers kept returning to divided polar lands, radial waters, axial centers, strange northern islands. Some of this is certainly copying. Cartographers borrowed from one another constantly. But digital comparison has shown that copying alone does not explain the strange consistency in the overall imagination of the far north. Even when details change, the same deeper shape survives. Circular order, centrality, symmetry, a world crown rather than a ruined margin. That matters because it suggests the North was not simply feared. It was idealized into form. If you lean closer to these maps in your imagination, the details become intimate. Inked channels bending inward, tiny notes about magnets, currents, and unreachable islands. Latin words pressed into cramped corners, decorative seas, blank zones still left pale enough to glow in candlelight. The whole page feels like a negotiation between report and desire. The mapmaker knows he does not know enough, yet he also knows he cannot bear to leave the pole meaningless. Some researchers in the 20th century pushed this problem much farther than mainstream scholarship is comfortable with. Charles Hapgood famously argued that certain ancient and Renaissance maps may preserve fragments of a much older cartographic tradition, one potentially reaching back into deep prehistory. Most professional historians reject his strongest claims, and with good reason. The evidentiary chain is weak, the leaps are large, and ancient maps attract overconfident interpretation, the way dark rooms attract whispered certainty. Still, even rejected ideas sometimes point toward genuine pressure points. In this case, the pressure point is simple. Why did so many cartographers imagine the North in such mathematically ordered ways? A more measured explanation exists. During the medieval warm period, northern waters were less hostile in some seasons than they would later become. Norse settlements reached Greenland. Voyagers moved farther into the North Atlantic than once seemed plausible. Reports of open water, strange daylight, unusual magnetic behavior, and green coasts could have filtered south, then thickened under repetition. That explanation has real elegance. A little exploration, a little misunderstanding, a little theological symmetry, and suddenly the far north becomes a fortunate realm. The AI overlay work done on some of these maps added another layer to the discussion. When researchers aligned old polar drawings with modern bathymetric data and satellite reconstructions, The results were not precise enough to prove ancient geographic knowledge, but they were interesting enough to keep the question alive. Certain circular and ridge-like forms loosely echoed submerged Arctic structures. Some radial layouts resembled drainage possibilities on lower sea-level landscapes. Most of this can still be coincidence. I would not pretend otherwise. But coincidence, repeated across centuries, has a way of becoming emotionally difficult to dismiss, even when it remains scientifically undecided. There is also the philosophical issue. Renaissance cartographers were not only geographers, they were system builders. To them, the world had to make sense as a whole. Symmetry mattered. Cosmic balance mattered. A sacred center at the east implied the possibility of another at the north. The farther a place was from ordinary contact, the more easily it absorbed metaphysical function. Hyperborea fit that need perfectly. It was old enough to sound authoritative, distant enough to resist contradiction, and radiant enough to absorb the human desire for a hidden order at the edge of things. That is why these maps often feel like philosophy drawn in ink. They do not merely record coastlines. They stage meaning. The source tradition also pointed out an intriguing pattern outside Europe. Arabic geographers hinted at lands of long daylight and frozen seas. Chinese sources spoke of strange northern zones where the sun behaved unlike anything known in temperate regions. None of these are simple confirmations of Hyperborea, of course. But when modern language models scanned translated corpora from different civilizations for repeated motifs associated with high-latitude anomalies, the same cluster kept appearing. Prolonged light, unusual freezing patterns, liminal geography, and a sense that the far north bordered something more than ordinary land. That does not prove a single shared source. It does suggest that the Arctic was repeatedly imagined as a threshold. I think threshold is the right word for the whole cartographic phase of the story. The old maps stand with one foot in evidence and one in longing. Their north is not fantasy in the simple sense. It is testimony under uncertainty. And Mercator's map in particular, with its fourfold division and central pull, acquires a strange emotional power when viewed through that lens. It is as though the map is trying to remember a world through fragments of reports, inherited symbols, and geometric instinct. The blankness at the top of the world becomes intolerable, so the mind reaches for order, and perhaps, in reaching it, recovers distorted pieces of something real. You know that feeling when you have forgotten a place from childhood and then see one object from it. A gate, a curtain, a pattern in tile. And suddenly the lost room begins to form again around that single surviving detail. The Hyperborean north in cartography feels a little like that. One coastline, one annotation, one note about endless daylight, one magnetic center, one old name written near the pole. Individually, they are weak. Together, they make the white space tremble. That trembling matters because maps do not preserve myths accidentally. To draw a thing is to give it provisional reality. Once placed on parchment, Hyperborea ceases to be only a poet's north. It becomes a destination for speculation, navigation, and later, scientific curiosity. The Greeks had given the legend a direction. The cartographers gave it coordinates. or at least the illusion of coordinates. They turned story into a problem. And problems invite investigation. That is where the parchment reaches its limit. Maps can preserve inherited memory, distort it, baptize it in geometry, or flatter it with order, but they cannot settle the underlying question. For that we have to leave the candlelit study, leave the quill, leave Mercator and his vanished sources, and turn to colder witnesses. Ice, pollen, sediment, ancient air trapped in Greenland cores, buried river valleys beneath frozen crust, the earth keeping records older and less theatrical than any mapmaker ever could. If Hyperborea was ever more than myth, the ground would have to remember it. And the farther north we go, the stranger that possibility becomes. Because beneath the silence of the modern Arctic, science has begun to uncover something the old cartographers only guessed at. A north that was not always white, not always dead, and not always beyond life. The maps, with all their errors and impossible symmetries, may have done one honest thing after all. They refused to believe the top of the world had always been empty. And perhaps that is the gentlest way to understand them. Not as proof, not as fraud, but as instruments of memory under pressure. The mapmaker inherits rumors, half reports, lost books, old sacred names, and a horizon no ship has fully mastered. He draws, anyway. He gives the north shape because shape is how human beings resist forgetting. Mercator did that. Ortelius did that. The lesser-known hands did it too. Their Arctic may never have existed exactly as they drew it. Yet in trying to measure legend, they preserved the possibility that legend had once been grounded in a world now altered beyond recognition. When the map reaches its limit, the Earth begins. That is where Hyperborea becomes more interesting, and in some ways more unsettling, because once we leave parchment and rumor behind, we step into a colder archive that does not care what poets wanted. Recently, teams of geologists fed Greenland ice core data, Siberian permafrost samples, fossil pollen records, and satellite radar scans into large climate models guided by machine learning systems trained to detect hidden correlations across enormous spans of time. What those systems revealed was not a simple frozen north stretching unchanged into the past. It was a rhythm. Warmth, collapse, recovery, loss. Again and again. That matters more than it may sound at first. For centuries, one of the easiest ways to dismiss Hyperborea was to say the Arctic was always too cold, too severe, too lifeless to support the kind of memory the myth seemed to preserve. But the AI-based reconstructions, cross-checked against the work of paleoclimatologists, ice core specialists, and Arctic geologists, keep returning the same message. The Arctic has never been static. It has changed abruptly, violently, and at times beautifully. The white silence people think of as eternal is not eternal at all. It is only the most recent face of a place with many faces. In laboratories in Copenhagen and elsewhere, long cylinders of Greenland ice are handled like sacred manuscripts. They are cut, lit, sampled, and read layer by layer. Each band of compressed snow holds trapped air, dust, volcanic ash, and microscopic, life. I have always found that almost unbearably moving. The planet keeps diaries, and some of them are written in breath. Ancient atmospheres sealed in blue-white darkness, waiting for someone to ask the right question. When researchers trained neural networks on those ice records, the models became especially good at detecting abrupt shifts that older analytical methods sometimes softened into gradual trends. What surfaced were sharp temperature jumps in the far north, known already to science, of course, but made newly vivid by the pattern recognition power of the models. Regional temperatures could rise by astonishing amounts in spans that would fit inside human memory. Not over some endless slow age, but in decades. The difference between tundra and something much greener, much richer, much more alive. One of the most striking windows was the Eemian interglacial, around 125,000 years ago, when northern latitudes were far warmer than most people imagine. Fossil pollen extracted from Siberian permafrost and island sediments showed birch, eller, and larch growing far beyond the modern tree line. Rich soils, peat deposits, and old plant material found in northern Canada and Alaska hinted at meadows and wetlands, where today there is only hard, cold ground and the long patience of ice. The AI models helped by linking these plant traces to climate thresholds with unusual precision. Instead of treating each discovery as an isolated curiosity, they began stitching them into landscape pictures. Rivers, shrublands, open plains, intervals of mildness. The North, at least in certain ages, was not a blank. It was habitable, more than habitable. It could be generous. Imagine that slowly. Not the Arctic of modern documentaries. Severe blue ice and bare rock under a gray sky. Imagine flowing water. Dark river channels threading through green ground. Birch leaves moving under endless summer light. Insects turning above wet meadows. Herds grazing where now sonar moves over submerged shelves and ice breaks in cold silence. A place still northern, still strange, still edged with danger, but not dead. Never simply dead. This is where the Hyperborean tradition stops sounding ridiculous and starts sounding dangerous in a different way. Because once the climate archive admits that the far north could once bloom, the old myth gains a foothold in possibility. Not proof, not yet, but a place to stand. Satellite radar has deepened the feeling. Beneath Greenland's ice, researchers have mapped ancient river valleys carved long before the modern ice sheet sealed them away. Under magnification and digital reconstruction, those channels look uncannily like the skeleton of a lost country. A landscape that once drained, flowed, and breathed under open air. Similar work in the high Arctic has detected buried landforms, basin structures, and traces of terrain that only make sense if the polar world was very different in earlier warm phases. The climate models do something else as well. They make the ancient descriptions of endless or enduring light feel less symbolic and more observational. Above the Arctic Circle, the summer sun does not behave like Mediterranean daylight. It circles. It lingers. It refuses to leave. A people living in or near such latitudes during one of the warmer northern windows would experience a world so visually strange that memory of it could survive for ages in altered form. A place of long light would be unforgettable. A place of long light, later lost to cold, might become sacred in recollection. That is where archaeology enters, quietly but decisively. One of the sites most often mentioned by researchers is the Yana rhinoceros horn site in Siberia. The artifacts there are old beyond the comfort of ordinary history, around 27,000 years. Spears, beads, worked ivory, traces of shelter, evidence that humans did not merely pass through the far north in panic, but lived there with ingenuity. The source tradition you gave me is right to linger here. These were not hopeless wanderers stumbling at the edge of the world. They were technicians of survival. Recently, archaeologists and computer vision specialists used AI imaging tools to reanalyze microscopic wear marks on ivory artifacts from northern sites. The systems compared tool signatures with thousands of experimental replicas and suggested a level of planning and heat control more sophisticated than earlier quick classifications had assumed. It is a small detail, perhaps, but I love such details. History often changes through the angle of a scratch on bone. Farther north, on Zhukov Island, another story waits. There, archaeologists uncovered remains of transport systems, bone tools, sled runners, and perhaps most evocative of all, ancient dog bones showing early selective breeding. These were not random campfires left by people already broken by cold. They were signs of return, planning, seasonal rhythm, social memory. Hearths rebuilt, tools shaped for repeated use, dogs bred for movement across a difficult world. That is not mere survival. That is adaptation becoming culture. If you imagine that landscape at the edge of one of its livable phases, the scene grows almost painfully vivid. Low dwellings built against wind, smoke moving thinly into cold air, dogs shifting in harness, reindeer and other game tracing routes across a broad horizon. Children growing up in a place later ages would consider impossible. The kind of world that lodges in the mind so deeply that even after it is gone, stories about it would retain an unusual warmth. The AI angle matters here too. Researchers used machine learning to combine faunal remains, isotope data, coastal reconstructions, and seasonal mobility models, creating simulations of how Arctic communities may have moved through yearly cycles. The result was not a picture of people barely clinging to life in isolated misery. It was a dynamic corridor, a north alive with movement, exchange, and local expertise. That phrase keeps returning to me. A north alive. And then, because the earth is never content to remain kind forever, the collapse comes. Around 12,900 years ago, the younger Dryas brought a sudden return of cold across the northern hemisphere. The warming world faltered. Ice expanded. Winds shifted. Landscapes that had opened began to close again. The great northern plains of Beringia, once linking Siberia and Alaska, were drowned and broken as seas rose. The AI climate models, when run backward and forward through this interval, make the transition feel brutally fast. Not instant, perhaps, but fast enough to scar generations. That is one of the reasons I think myths of lost northern lands retain such emotional force. A slow change can be forgotten. A rapid collapse cannot. If your grandparents walked grassy northern ground under long light, and your own children saw those roots vanish into ice, sea, and silence, the memory would not disappear politely. It would harden into story. The source script beautifully captured this point. That climate is the Earth's memory, and myth is ours. I think the newest research supports that more than many scholars would have admitted a generation ago. Each buried pollen grain, each trapped air bubble, each ancient river under ice, each Arctic tool worked by human hands, all of it says the same thing with different accents. The far north opened many times. It nourished life. It closed again. Such cycles would not only move animals and coastlines, they would move human imagination. And if imagination was carrying a memory of a luminous north, then Hyperborea becomes easier to hear, not as a perfect photograph of a single lost kingdom, but as a long cultural echo of real environmental windows. When the world above the north wind was richer than later, people believed. There is a softness to that realization that I did not expect the first time I sat with this material. The myth becomes less ridiculous and more human. A people do not need to preserve exact coordinates to preserve the emotional truth of a place. They only need to remember that it was brighter, kinder, more alive, and that its loss changed the roots of families forever. Climate science, for all its graphs and models and isotopic ratios, ends up saying something almost tender here. The North was not always a punishment. Sometimes it was a home. Sometimes, for a while, it may even have felt like the best home on Earth. That is where the next part of our journey has to go. Away from ice cores and buried soils, and into mythic afterlives spread across continents, where Ireland, Scandinavia, Siberia, and Greece all seem to whisper about a bright northern homeland that vanished, and yet somehow never stopped calling. When one culture remembers a lost northern paradise, it can be dismissed as elegant fiction. When many cultures, separated by distance, language, and time, preserve versions of the same broad memory, the atmosphere changes. It does not become proof, not automatically, but it becomes harder to wave away with a quick learned gesture. This is where Hyperborea stops belonging only to the Greeks. The old northern light begins speaking in many voices. Recently, comparative mythology researchers used large language models to scan translated corpora from Celtic epics, Norse sagas, Siberian oral narratives, Sami song traditions, and ancient travel accounts, searching for recurring motifs that clustered around northern origin memory. The systems were not looking for identical names. They were looking for structures, endless light, altered time, a fertile or blessed northern homeland, a catastrophic cooling or withdrawal, and migration toward darker lands. The overlap was striking enough to make even cautious scholars pause. Among the Celts, the memory takes one of its most beautiful forms, Betir na Nog, the land of eternal youth. Across the western sea, beyond ordinary reach, heroes found a realm where no one aged, where beauty endured, where time moved strangely. At first glance, it seems unrelated to Hyperborea. West is not north. Irish seas are not the Arctic. Yet the emotional architecture is extraordinarily close. A remote, luminous land, a place of abundance beyond decay, a region real enough to journey to, yet impossible to hold. When travelers returned, ordinary time had betrayed them. Centuries had passed. I have always thought altered time is one of the clearest signs of exile memory in myth. When a world is lost, the people left behind begin measuring it by a different clock. The golden country becomes unreachable not only in space, but in duration. The old homeland lives on in a time that no longer matches the present. That is exactly the sort of thing one would expect if real places disappeared under environmental change and survived only in ritual story. The same AI comparisons that linked Hyperborea with prolonged light also flagged repeated language around temporal distortion in distant paradise myths. Not because ancient people were constructing science fiction, but because cultural memory often preserves distance by turning it into altered duration. A land you cannot go back to becomes a land where time is wrong. Then there is Thule, Pythias of Massalia, sailing in the 4th century before Christ, described a northern region where the sun did not fully set. Later writers mocked him, doubted him, or treated him as a fabulist. Yet in that one detail he was simply correct. Above certain latitudes, summer light does behave in exactly that uncanny way. The AI models cross-checking polar-solar behavior against ancient travel descriptions gave Pythias unusually high credibility on that point. Not because every detail in later retellings is reliable, but because one central observation, the unsettling persistence of light, matches the real North too well to dismiss lazily. In the Norse world, the memory changes shape again. Thule becomes less a single island and more a threshold, a land at the edge of the known where daylight, sea, and distance behave strangely. The divine geography of the Norse also leans northward in a significant way. Gods associated with radiant bridges, shining halls, and a cosmic order extending out of a northern frame suggest more than literary convenience. The source script connected this to ancestral migration memory, and that connection becomes harder to ignore once climate and archaeology have already shown that northern routes opened and closed dramatically across prehistory. Imagine standing on a high northern coast in late summer. Somewhere the light lingers so long that evening, never quite arrives. The sea is cold but navigable. The horizon glows silver. The air itself seems to resist darkness. A person raised in such a world would not need much persuading that the North had a sacred quality. A place where the ordinary rules of day and night softened would naturally gather gods. Farther east, the old stories of Arctic and subarctic peoples grow even more direct. Among Siberian traditions, including those of the Yakut, Chukchi, and related northern groups, there are tales of earlier worlds where warmth endured longer, where the sky gave more light, where rivers moved through livable country now claimed by cold. Anthropologists, linguists, and oral tradition specialists have begun using AI-assisted motif analysis to compare these narratives at scale. And again, the same pattern returns. a fertile north, sudden change, southward movement, memory carried in song and image. What I find especially haunting is that some of these traditions describe the disaster not only as cold, but as the death of the sun or the failure of the sky fire. In geological language, that is not what happened, of course, but in lived experience, it may be very close. If long seasons of light shorten, if warmth retreats, if animals migrate, if rivers freeze earlier and longer, then from the perspective of human feeling, the sun really has failed. Myth is not bad science. It is emotional precision. Rock art adds to the strangeness. In parts of Siberia and northern Eurasia, there are carved images of spiral suns, long rays, moving herds, and human figures oriented within environmental drama. These should not be overinterpreted. Archaeology deserves patience. Yet when image recognition tools compare such motifs across northern and later southern sites, they find enough recurrence in solar geometry and migration imagery to keep the possibility of shared symbolic inheritance alive. The source tradition identified 3 recurring motifs across these myths: a northern homeland rich in light, a catastrophic cooling or destruction, and a migration carrying memory outward. That triad is one of the most persuasive parts of the whole Hyperborea argument, because it appears in forms that are different enough not to seem copied, yet similar enough to suggest deep structural kinship. The Sami traditions preserve another variation. Songs and old poetic fragments speak of a first land where light and dark were held in a more balanced relation, and of great white storms, or world changes, that broke that condition. Modern linguists, working with ancient roots, have noted that some northern vocabularies for light, ice, and direction carry remarkable antiquity. Language itself begins to look like a fossil bed. Words survive after landscapes drown. That is one of the quiet miracles of human continuity. People lose countries and keep metaphors. They lose coastlines and keep songs. They lose migration routes and keep sacred directions. Memory gets compressed until only the bright skeleton remains. Genetics supports the possibility of such large-scale memory movement, though genetics cannot by itself tell stories. What it can do is confirm that northern populations moved widely during and after major climate transitions. Ancient DNA from Siberia, Thuringia, and later dispersals into Europe, Asia, and the Americas reveals repeated movement out of Arctic and subarctic corridors during habitable windows and environmental collapse phases. The source script treated this as a kind of biological outline for the same mythic picture, and that seems fair. Genes carry bodies. Stories carry worlds. Often they travel together. I think one reason Hyperborea still feels so emotionally charged is that it may encode not only wonder, but exile. A paradise lost is one thing. A homeland lost is another. The myths we are tracing feel much more like the second kind. They are not content merely to describe a lovely place. They grieve it. They keep circling its absence. The brightness is always shadowed by departure. You know that feeling when a family story survives for generations, even though no one can now point to the original house. Only the river nearby, or the orchard, or the hill where the road once bent. The details blur, but the ache remains exact. That is how these northern myths behave. Hyperborea in Greece, Tionano in Ireland, Thule in northern travel lore, the shining plains in Siberian memory. They are not identical, but all of them seem to point backward toward a region made sacred by loss. The AI comparisons also highlighted something else, a moral component often attached to these northern lands. In many versions, the lost bright world is not only warmer or healthier, it is more harmonious. Human beings in it are less corrupt, less burdened, closer to order. Then the world cools, or people fail, or balance is broken. Physical catastrophe and moral decline begin to merge. That is not surprising. Cultures often translate environmental disaster into ethical narrative, because ethics is how the human mind makes suffering legible. In Hyperborea, that takes the form of peace, long life, and closeness to Apollo. In Irish tradition, it becomes youth and untarnished beauty. In Northern Eurasian memory, it can become the withdrawal of divine favor or the ending of a brighter world. The pattern matters because it shows myth preserving not only climate memory, but emotional and civilizational memory. The North becomes where we were better before the cold came. Archaeology and paleoclimate do not force us to accept every such story literally. They do something more subtle. They remove the old objection that such myths are climatically absurd. The Arctic did host habitable landscapes. Northern populations did move dramatically. Long daylight was real. Ecological collapse was real. Sea rise and drowning plains were real. Once those facts are admitted, the myths no longer stand outside the possible. They stand inside it, translated into the language of longing. This is why I think the phrase collective remembrance fits so well. Not collective in the sense of one global meeting of ancient peoples. Of course, history is not that tidy. Collective in the sense that many populations pass through analogous environmental trauma tied to northern change. And over time, their descendants kept telling versions of that trauma through local cosmologies. Different names, different gods. Same horizon. By the firelight, that horizon feels very close tonight. A world of great northern brightness. A catastrophic cooling. Southward movement. The carrying of songs, symbols, and sacred direction. If you follow the pattern long enough, Hyperborea begins to sound less like an isolated Greek fantasy and more like one branch of a much older human memory tree. And once that thought settles, another rises naturally. If so many peoples looked north when speaking of origin, Oda, and lost perfection, what was it about the North itself that made it so cosmically magnetic? Why did the pole become sacred in so many civilizations? Why did the axis of the sky, the unsetting stars, and the motion of light around a fixed center become one of humanity's deepest symbolic obsessions? That is where we have to go next. Upward, not outward. Away from migration and into the heavens, where the lost northern land may have survived even after geography failed, fixed not on earth, but in the still point of the stars. When ancient eyes turned upward, they did not see an empty black ceiling. They saw order. They saw repetition. They saw a wheel of lights turning around a still point that refused to move. And in that stillness, many civilizations found something so persuasive that they built whole cosmologies around it. This is where the memory of Hyperborea leaves the Earth for a while and survives in the sky. Recently, archaeoastronomers, astrophysicists, and historians fed alignments from ancient monuments, star catalogs reconstructed from old texts, and simulations of axial precession into advanced AI systems trained to detect long-duration patterns that human researchers can miss when the data becomes too vast. The result was strangely beautiful. Across cultures that had no easy reason to agree, the same symbolic structure kept appearing: a fixed north, a revolving heaven, a central axis, a sacred order anchored to the pole. That pattern matters because it gives the Hyperborean tradition a second life. Even if the land itself vanished or changed beyond recognition, the sky above it remained. The stars kept circling. The pole remained the calm center around which the visible heavens moved. To a human being living in or near the far north, that would not have felt like abstraction. It would have felt like architecture. Today we call the current pole star Polaris, but the sky shifts over long ages. Around the late 3rd millennium before Christ, the star nearest the north celestial pole was Thuban, a pale point in Draco. Ancient people did not speak in our mathematical language of axial precession, yet careful observers could still notice that the heavens possessed a center, and that the center mattered. Everything visible seemed to honor it. Whole constellations wheeled around it. The sky performed deference. I have always found that image quietly overwhelming. The heavens themselves appearing to circle a still point. It is hard to imagine a more powerful symbol of order. If a people had once lived in a northern world where light behaved strangely, where the sun sometimes lingered and the stars moved in vast, unsetting arcs, then the sacredness of the pole would have entered their minds very early. Not as theory, but as atmosphere. This is where the AI comparison work became especially useful. Researchers compared sacred descriptions of cosmic mountains, world pillars, central stars, unsetting lights, and axial thrones across Egyptian, Greek, Indian, Chinese, and Mesoamerican materials. The systems did not conclude that all these civilizations came from one simple source. That would be much too crude. What they did reveal was a deep recurrent preference for the same symbolic geometry. Heaven turns. Earth needs a center. Order flows from alignment with that center. The north becomes the most stable metaphor available to the ancient imagination. In Egypt, the circumpolar stars were called the imperishables, the stars that never sank. That phrase alone tells you everything about how they were felt. They did not die into the horizon as other stars did. They remained. The Great Pyramid, built with a precision that still makes modern people uneasy, contains shafts aligned toward important stellar targets of its age, including the northern sky. Some scholars debate the exact ritual purpose, and it is wise to let that debate remain open. Still, the broader point is undeniable. The pharaohs wanted their dead to rise toward the unsetting stars. Immortality was imagined as joining the northern wheel. If you picture that slowly, The image becomes almost tender, a narrow shaft of darkness cutting upward through stone. Cool air in the inner chamber, the body of the king sealed in the earth, yet the architecture still opening him toward the sky that does not perish. The north is not merely direction there. It is endurance. India preserved the same deep structure in a different language. Mount Meru, the golden mountain at the center of the worlds, rises as an axis of heaven and earth, and from it order extends outward. Rivers divide the world. The stars revolve around the summit. The geometry is so close to later polar diagrams that one feels the old symbolic magnetism immediately. Modern AI, image comparison, used on mandala structures and early cosmographic diagrams, found repeated radial forms that strongly resemble later cartographic and mythic descriptions of northern sacred centers. Again, not proof of one origin, but proof of a recurring orientation. Humans keep imagining order as something centered, elevated, and bright. In China, the same intuition appears around the polar region of the sky, the purple enclosure, the still center around which the heavens move. The emperor, in earthly imitation of the pole star, sits as the fixed point of the state. Architecture mirrors cosmology. Square earth below, circular heaven above. The state becomes an imitation of the sky. That is one of the great ancient habits of mind. To govern well is to align the human world with celestial pattern. What fascinates me is how often the source of that pattern leans northward. Not eastward, where the sun rises, not southward, where warmth is obvious, but northward, where the wheel of the heavens declares its center most clearly. Even across the ocean in Mesoamerica, builders oriented their monuments with a seriousness that makes pure coincidence feel increasingly thin. The details vary, of course. Different skies, different calendars, different ritual worlds. But true north, solstices, equinox, and celestial rhythm still matter. The great structures become observatories, calendars, mirrors of order. The AI systems comparing monument orientation data across continents highlighted a repeated obsession with balance between light and darkness, with fixed points and turning cycles. Human beings, once they build civilizations, keep recreating the cosmos in stone. The source tradition also lingers on Apollo, and rightly so. His annual departure northward and return southward is one of the most revealing symbolic bridges in the Hyperborean material. In one sense, it is seasonal theology. The sun god leaving and returning, darkness yielding to light. In another, it preserves a directional sacredness. Renewal comes from the north. Hyperborea is not merely a lost country. It is the hidden homeland of returning radiance. That is a strange inversion for a Mediterranean people, and that strangeness is one reason the story still has force. If the Greeks had simply placed all blessing in the east with dawn, the story would feel more predictable. Instead, they place Apollo's winter dwelling beyond the north wind. It is as though the ultimate reserve of light is stored where one least expects it. From a modern scientific perspective, one can say that these myths encode observations of tilt, season, and celestial motion without using technical vocabulary. That is probably true. The earth leans, The seasons shift. The pole gives the sky a still center. Ancient people noticed. Yet that explanation does not flatten the beauty of the thing. It deepens it. The human mind watched the heavens carefully enough to turn astronomy into belonging. There is another layer here that I think matters. A people who once remembered a northern world of unusual light would not only preserve that memory in stories of paradise, they would also preserve it in cosmology. The land might vanish. The sky would not. If the homeland could no longer be reached, the heavens above it could still be watched from anywhere. In that sense, the celestial pole becomes a perfect vessel for exile memory. It is fixed. It is visible. It is emotionally inexhaustible. You know that feeling when a house from childhood is gone, yet one smell, one beam of afternoon light, one direction of the road keeps calling the whole place back into the mind. The pole star traditions of the ancient world feel like that. The land may be inaccessible or altered, but the sky keeps handing down the same clue. Look north. There is still a center. That clue enters architecture very deeply. The source script moved from sky to monument for a reason. Gösek in Germany, Nabta Playa in Egypt, Newgrange in Ireland, Stonehenge in Britain, Chaco in North America. The details differ. The dates differ. The ritual meanings differ. But all reveal a sustained ancient seriousness about the movement of light and the structure of the heavens. AI pattern analysis on site alignments has become increasingly good at distinguishing random orientation from astronomically intentional design, and many of these places fall decisively on the intentional side. The Gösek Circle, with its carefully aligned gates, is especially moving to me because of its age and simplicity. Wood, earth, openings cut to meet the solstitial sun. A human attempt to hold the turning of light in a stable form. Newgrange does the same with winter sun, allowing a narrow beam to penetrate deep into stone only at the right moment. One can almost feel the old northern ache in that. Light must return. It must be awaited. It must be welcomed. And if your ancestors once lived closer to the edge where light itself behaved in extreme ways, then building for its return would not be decorative. It would be existential. This is why I think the Hyperborean material, even at its most speculative, still belongs inside serious contemplation of ancient worldviews. It sits where observation, memory, longing, and cosmology all overlap. The North becomes more than place. It becomes axis, measure, promise, a hidden standard by which earthly life imagines order. The ancient builders may never have said that in one simple sentence. They did something more durable. They aligned stones. They aimed shafts. They placed doors toward sunrise or stars. They carved circles and spirals. They taught the body to move through sacred space in ways that mimicked the heavens. And all the while, in stories and hymns, the Old North remained luminous, distant, and strangely alive. So when we speak of Hyperborea now, we are not speaking only of a possible Arctic homeland. We are speaking of a memory that may have migrated upward into the most stable thing ancient people could still trust: the sky. The still point The unsetting stars. A paradise lost on Earth, perhaps, but not entirely lost to vision. There is a softness to these old sky traditions that I do not want to lose under too much argument. It is easy, when discussing axial motion and celestial poles, to make ancient people sound like primitive scientists waiting to become modern ones. They were not. They were careful watchers whose observations entered prayer, kingship, burial, and architecture all at once. A pole star was never only a datum. It was companionship, a still witness over lives that otherwise dissolved quickly into hunger, cold, and uncertainty. Think of a winter night on an open plain before cities were common, before writing hardened memory, before law codes and dynasties. The cold touches the face immediately. Breath smokes. The dark is almost absolute except for the stars. Then the eye adjusts. The wheel appears. Slowly, patiently, inevitably, the heavens turn. Everything moves except the center. A child shown that pattern for the first time would never entirely forget it. A people who returned to it for generations would eventually build their entire idea of order around it. And yet sky alone cannot satisfy the question. A symbolic north is powerful, but the human heart still wants ground under it. Real coastlines, real settlements, real traces of feet, tools, dogs, fides, and thawed earth. If the heavens kept the shape of the memory, perhaps the Arctic ground itself kept something even older. Fragments buried under permafrost, drowned shelves, and continental ridges waiting for the ice to release them. Ice has a peculiar morality. It erases almost everything we would like to find. Walls, timber, roads, woven things, small domestic traces that make the past feel warm and inhabited. And yet it preserves context with an almost cruel generosity. Pollen survives. Bones survive. Riverbeds remain under frozen burden. Soil keeps the chemistry of vanished climates. Ancient DNA lingers where whole ecosystems have gone silent. If Hyperborea ever had a physical body, the Arctic would not offer it back as a marble city. It would offer it back as a patient field of clues. Recently, geologists, paleogeneticists, and remote sensing specialists processed seismic surveys, bathymetric scans, sediment cores, radar imaging, and ancient DNA recovered from Arctic soils through machine learning systems designed to reconstruct vanished landscapes. What emerged was not a single lost continent rising theatrically from the sea, but something in a way more persuasive. A repeated pattern of exposed shelves, drowned plains, continental ridges, ancient river systems, and habitable northern corridors appearing during warmer windows, then vanishing beneath water, ice, or both. The Arctic Ocean floor is not empty. That simple fact already changes the emotional landscape of the myth. Beneath the modern frozen surface lie mountain chains, submerged plateaus, broad shelves, and continental fragments that belonged to very different worlds at different times. One of the most famous of these is the Lomonosov Ridge, a long underwater mountain chain stretching across the Arctic basin. Geological samples show it is continental in character. That means it was once attached to land, once part of solid crust above or nearer to the surface, not merely a volcanic wrinkle born in deep ocean darkness. I have always found that deeply suggestive, not because it proves Hyperborea in any easy sense, but because it reminds us that the modern map of the North is provisional. What now looks like timeless ocean and ice was once arranged differently. Vast shelves stood exposed when sea levels were lower. Coasts extended hundreds of kilometers farther than they do now. Islands were peninsulas. Peninsulas were open plains. The North has never held still long enough to deserve the confidence with which modern people often imagine it. The East Siberian Shelf is an especially striking example. Today, it lies underwater, broad and cold. During lower sea level phases, it formed an immense plain linking regions that are now separate. Add Beringia to that picture, the land joining Siberia and Alaska during glacial times, and the so-called edge of the world becomes something else entirely. A corredor, a country of movement, a northern steppe rich enough to carry animals, people, and memory across enormous distances. The AI-aided landscape models became useful here because they could combine sea level history, glacial loading, isostatic rebound, river incision patterns, and sediment transport to visualize these northern worlds not as static maps, but as living transitions. Plains opened, water drained through channels, now hidden. Wetlands formed. Then sea rose, ice shifted, and whole terrains were swallowed. The systems did not find one eternal Hyperborea. They found a sequence of northern opportunities, geological moments when the world beyond the north wind would indeed have been far more hospitable and extensive than later ages could imagine. That phrase from the source script stays with me. Hyperborea as a geological moment. I think that is one of the wisest ways to hold the story. Not as a single lost empire with neat borders, but as a recurring habitable north that appeared, flourished, and disappeared often enough to leave profound scars in both land and culture. Modern sonar surveys of the Chukchi and Laptev Seas reveal ancient terraces and channel-like structures resembling drowned shorelines and river systems. Core samples taken from these regions include freshwater clays, peat-like deposits, and pollen that should not be present on deep marine floors unless those areas were once terrestrial wetlands or shallow lowland environments. The Earth keeps admitting the same thing from different angles. The North was not always as it is now. And then there are the remains that emerge not from theory, but from thaw. Mammoth tusks eroding from cliffs in Siberia. Dark ancient soils appearing from retreating permafrost. Plant matter, seeds, fragments of forest memory where only frozen emptiness seemed possible. Ancient DNA extracted from permafrost has identified whole ecological communities that no human eye has seen for tens of thousands of years. When the AI systems compared these ecological signatures against known climate windows, they reinforced the idea of repeated northern habitability with a confidence earlier generations of researchers could only dream about. If you imagine the Arctic listening to all of this, it begins to feel less like an empty desert and more like a locked archive, finally being opened room by room. A buried valley here, a drowned shelf there, a layer of peat, a root system, a set of bonnes, a worked tool, a dog bred for transport. One clue at a time, and none of them noisy. The North does not reveal itself dramatically. It yields in silences. The source script also drew an important parallel with Doggerland, the drowned plain that once linked Britain to continental Europe. That comparison matters because Doggerland taught modern archaeology a humbling lesson. Entire inhabited worlds can vanish under rising water and leave only broken traces on seabeds that later people cross without suspecting what lies below. If that happened in the North Sea, why should the Arctic shelves be treated as immune to similar histories? They should not. Glacial isostasy adds another layer of complexity. Ice sheets are so heavy that they depress the land beneath them. When they retreat, the land rises again, but not uniformly. Some places rebound, others sink. Coasts shift in ways that can drown old ground while raising other regions. This means the Arctic is not just a place altered by temperature. It is a place physically reworked by weight and release, pressed downward, then allowed to breathe upward again. The shape we see now is only one frame in a longer geological motion. I think that is why the old stories of drowned northern worlds, whirlpools, vanished coasts, and impossible islands have such strange staying power. They are not geologically precise. Of course, ancient memory did not speak in isostatic rebound curves, but it did preserve the emotional reality of land changing too quickly and too completely for ordinary continuity to survive. This is also where the maps return in a more interesting light. Mercator's northern rivers, converging toward a central basin, once looked like pure cosmological fancy. Now geological reconstructions suggest that parts of the Arctic basin may indeed have once been structured by radial or converging drainage systems across exposed terrain. Not identical to the old drawings, no, but close enough in spirit to make one hesitate before laughing too quickly. The human imagination, even when wrong in detail, often remembers shape. And then genetics enters again. This time not as mythic atmosphere, but as inherited root. Ancient DNA research has transformed our sense of northern prehistory. Haplogroups moving through Siberia, Beringia, into the Americas. Maternal and paternal lineages crossing and diverging along Arctic corridors. The Malta child near Lake Baikal. The populations of ancient North Eurasia. The genetic signatures carried into both Europe and the New World. None of this proves Hyperborea as a single polity. It does something quieter and perhaps more important. It confirms that the far north and subarctic world were not empty margins. They were human roads. Researchers working with AI-assisted ancient DNA clustering recently emphasized how population pulses align with habitable northern windows. When climate opened the route, people moved. When cold and drowning closed it, they retreated or dispersed. That rhythm feels almost identical to the emotional rhythm of the myths we traced earlier. Warmth, settlement, light, catastrophe, movement, memory. Language may preserve the same motion. Comparative linguists have long noticed old roots tied to brightness, whiteness, direction, sky, and north recurring through very ancient vocabularies. The source script highlighted the root behind Boreas and other terms of brightness. And while etymology is always a field that rewards humility, the symbolic cluster itself is undeniable. Light and north stay close in the old mind, not because the north is always bright, but because in high summer it behaves with a brilliance that leaves a permanent mark on anyone who has seen it. Imagine a child born in one of those ancient northern corridors during a favorable climatic window. Endless evening light, the sun circling rather than falling. Herds moving across open plains now buried under Arctic water. Dogs shifting in camp. Smoke under a mild sky that later ages would never believe belonged so far north. That child grows old. The climate changes. The roots fail. The family moves south. The grandchildren hear stories of the place where light did not die. How could that not become myth? That may be the most human explanation of Hyperborea, and perhaps the most haunting. Not a fraudulent fantasy, not a literal marble capital hidden under the pole, but the preserved memory of a recurrent northern world where climate, migration, and perception combined to make life feel unusually ordered, luminous, and alive. A place too unstable to remain, yet too extraordinary to forget. The source tradition moved next into visible symbols. Spirals, circles, polar geometry carried south into later monuments and cosmologies. That movement now feels completely natural. If real northern populations traveled during these windows, and if those populations experienced unusual solar behavior and environmental collapse, then the symbols they carried south would not be random. They would center on light, circular motion, return, and orientation. The Arctic would survive not in walls, but in patterns. One of the most moving details in all of this is how little the Earth needs to preserve in order to change a story. A single layer of peat under marine sediment, a cluster of pollen grains where no forest should ever have grown, a tool edge worn by human hands in a latitude older scholarship called impossible. None of these things is grand by itself. Yet together they alter the emotional gravity of the North. The Arctic stops being a blank and becomes a palimpsest, written over many times, but never fully erased. I think that is why modern discoveries in the Arctic feel so different from discoveries in easier landscapes. A lost road in Italy or a buried wall in the Levant enters a world already crowded with accepted civilizations. But a thawing slope in Siberia or an exposed shelf in the far north has a different power. It does not merely add detail. It reopens assumptions. It reminds us that whole theaters of human life may have appeared and vanished in places later ages, misunderstood completely. That is where we are about to go. From drowned shelves and ancient genes into the more delicate ruins left in the human mind. Wheels carved in stone, spirals, solstitial gates, north-facing monuments, the architecture of memory. Because if Hyperborea left no great city that can be excavated in one triumphant season, it may still live in something more durable than stone. The way people learn to see order itself. By the time memory has crossed from myth into climate, from climate into migration, and from migration into the turning sky, something subtle begins to happen. The lost North no longer needs a surviving city to remain alive. It can survive as pattern. It can survive in the shapes people keep building. the symbols they keep carving, the alignments they keep trusting when they turn stone and timber toward the path of light. This is where Hyperborea becomes harder to look for and harder to dismiss, because it no longer waits for us as a ruin. It waits as repetition. That is not Hyperborea proved. It is Hyperborea remembered in the way human beings arrange meaning. I think this is one of the most beautiful and dangerous parts of the story, because the human mind is very good at making connections where none truly exist. And yet it is also very good at carrying old worlds forward in disguised form. The difficulty lies in telling those two powers apart. Consider the circle first. At the coldest human edge, the circle is not abstract. It is shelter. Arctic and subarctic peoples build rounded structures because the curve conserves warmth, manages wind, and keeps life gathered around a center. The center itself is rarely empty. Hearth, fire, lamp, smoke opening, the living heart of the dwelling. When later ancient architectures far to the south keep favoring circles, rings, enclosed rotundas, and solar courtyards, the resemblance may not prove direct inheritance, but it does awaken the old thought. Perhaps geometry first learned through survival later became sacred, because survival itself had already taught people what harmony felt like. If you imagine one of those northern homes under a sky that never quite darkens in summer, the image becomes intimate. Curved walls holding back wind, animal skins breathing slightly with movement inside, a low central fire-making warmth feel visible. Children sleeping while elders watch the light move around the horizon instead of across it. The whole house becomes a small earth under a circling sky. Once a people learns to live inside such a form, the form is never merely practical again. It becomes emotional. It becomes cosmological without anyone needing to declare it so. That is one reason circles later appear so powerfully in monumental space. Nupta, Playa in Egypt, Gosak in Germany, Stonehenge in Britain, Newgrange in Ireland. The source script rightly lingers on that point. For people shaped by northern extremes, the return of light is not decorative. It is everything. A civilization that grows from memories of long day and catastrophic cold would treat solar recurrence with extraordinary seriousness. And that seriousness is written into architecture with a patience that feels almost devotional. Newgrange is one of the best examples to sit with at night, a mound older than many easier histories. A narrow passage. Darkness held for most of the year. Then at the winter solstice, light entering with unbearable precision, moving down the corridor until the hidden chamber glows. I have always found that event less like engineering and more like a promise kept. Someone built that structure believing that light must be welcomed back into the deepest dark in a way the body could feel. That belief could have emerged independently, yes, but it also fits beautifully with a world of people carrying an old northern memory of seasonal extremity. Spirals make the same case more softly. Across rock art in Northern Europe, Siberia, Atlantic Europe, and beyond, spirals recur with a stubborn persistence. Archaeologists have many explanations for them. Water, journey, transformation, solar motion, life cycles. All of those may be true at once. But when large petroglyph datasets are compared, spiralsuns, radiating circles, and turning motifs repeatedly group with sites linked to solar observation or seasonal threshold space. Ancient people kept picturing light as motion around a center, and that, if you think about it long enough, is exactly how the sun behaves near the far north. Not rising sharply and dropping cleanly, but circling, lingering, turning like a wheel along the horizon. A child raised under that sky would not first imagine sunlight as a line. That child would imagine it as a curve. This may be why so many ancient symbols of order are round. Wheels, radiant discs, spiralsuns, halud circles. Even later sacred emblems, far removed from the Arctic, retain this old visual instinct. The sacred is what returns. The sacred is what turns without losing its center. The axis comes next. Every major cosmology eventually imagines one. A mountain, a tree, a pillar, a ladder, a tower, something connecting worlds vertically. In the Norse imagination, it is the world tree. In India, it is Meru. In Egypt, the Djed gives stability its spine. In Mesoamerica, a world tree or cosmic road binds layers of reality. It is difficult to overstate how widespread this pattern is. Human beings all over the world keep insisting that reality has a center line. The source script connected this to the North Celestial Pole, and I think that was exactly right. The heavens provide a natural model for the axis. The stars revolve. The center seems still. The world must therefore have a hidden pillar. Once that thought takes root, architecture begins to imitate it. Upright stones, central posts, towers, raised sanctuaries. Even political systems borrow the form. King at center, capital at center, sacred fire at center. A world held together by alignment rather than by mere spread. True North orientation becomes especially interesting here. The Great Pyramid, Teotihuacan, Angkor, Long Barrows in Britain, numerous ancient compounds across Eurasia, all reveal strong, directional seriousness. Not all point perfectly north, and not all need to. What matters is the refusal of randomness. Human builders again and again tie earthly order to sky order. You know that feeling when a room is arranged so thoughtfully that you relax before understanding why. Ancient sacred architecture often works like that. The body senses order before the mind names it. A corridor catches dawn. A chamber waits for winter light. A circle gathers people beneath a sky they have already been taught to trust. Hyperborea, in this way, may not survive as a city, but as the instinct that a good world should mirror celestial balance. This idea becomes even more interesting when we add genetics and migration back into the picture. Ancient DNA studies have already shown that northern populations moved through corridors linking Siberia, Beringia, Europe, and the Americas in different phases. Those people would not have carried only tools and genes. They would have carried perception, a way of seeing sky, season, danger, and return. Even language may preserve these symbolic habits. Roots associated with brightness, Whiteness, orientation, rightness, and order often cluster in ancient vocabularies in ways that make light a moral as well as physical fact. To stand rightly is to stand in alignment. To know direction is to know truth. The old Indo-European and related lexical fields do not prove an Arctic homeland by themselves, but they do show that light and order were deeply fused in early thought. Once fused, that pair becomes architecturally and ritually fertile. The source script described Hyperborea not only as a place, but as a pattern of consciousness, and I think that phrase deserves to be kept, because at this stage of the story, that may be the most accurate way to hold it. A northern mode of attention, a memory of life depending on exact awareness of season and solar return. A symbolic system born where the sky could not be ignored. Carried southward, it would not need to remain ethnically pure or geographically precise. It would survive simply by being useful. Useful for ritual. Useful for kingship. Useful for architecture. Useful for hope. That usefulness matters. Myths endure when they explain reality beautifully. Symbols endure when they organize experience well. A circle that once conserved warmth can become sacred because sacredness often begins in what kept people alive. A solstice chamber becomes holy because the return of light had once meant the difference between survival and collapse. A pillar becomes cosmic because the sky itself seemed to turn around an unseen post. There is a reason these forms feel peaceful even now. They slow the body. A circle gathers rather than scatters. A northward line steadies the eye. A solstice chamber teaches waiting. A spiral lets motion remain gentle instead of violent. If an ancient northern consciousness helped shape these choices, then what survived was not only information, but temperament. A way of enduring uncertainty by arranging life around return. That, to me, is one of the strongest, quiet arguments for a real memory hidden inside the symbolism. The patterns do not celebrate conquest first. They celebrate orientation. If Hyperborea left a legacy, this may be what it looks like. Not a marble ruin. Not a royal archive waiting in perfect preservation. Instead, a set of recurring forms. Circular sanctuaries. Solar spirals. True north reverence. The axis linking worlds. Cultures inventing them again and again, or perhaps remembering them again and again, because the oldest northern experience had marked the human nervous system too deeply to be lost. There is something very calm about that conclusion. It does not need spectacle. It only asks us to notice how often the ancient world kept building the same answer to the same question. How do we stay aligned with light when light can leave? Hyperborea may have been one answer once on the ground. Later, it became an answer in stone, ritual, and sky-oriented design. The earth and the mind agreeing to keep the memory alive by pattern. And because patterns are quieter than monuments, they can cross ages more easily. A ruined palace may disappear. A spiral carved into stone can be copied by a child without knowing its first meaning. A solstice gate can be rebuilt by descendants who only know that their elders waited there for the return. A sacred direction can survive long after the original landscape that taught it has drowned or frozen. That is why the next movement of the story has to become darker before it becomes clear again. Once a powerful northern pattern exists, later ages can claim it, twist it, and use it for purposes very far from its original tenderness. Hyperborea will not remain a memory of balance and light forever. In the modern age, it will be seized, distorted, racialized, and dragged into one of the ugliest chapters in the afterlife of myth. Before we return to the earth for a final, honest reckoning, we have to pass through that shadow. Because a legend this old did not survive into modernity untouched. By the end of the 19th century, Hyperborea had become dangerous in a new way. For centuries it had remained a symbol of lost balance, sacred distance, impossible light, and the human memory of a world beyond ordinary maps. Then modern obsession took hold. Industrial science expanded. Empires classified everything they could reach. Mystics, nationalists, occultists, and racial theorists went searching not for an old harmony, but for possession. The North, once a shared longing, became something people tried to own. Recently, historians used AI-assisted text tracing to follow how the word Hyperborea and related polar myths moved through modern esoteric literature. Nationalist pamphlets, pseudo-scientific treatises, and political rhetoric. The systems revealed a disturbing transformation. Terms once linked to light, cosmic order, and lost memory gradually became entangled with bloodlines, spiritual hierarchy, invented ancestry, and fantasies of rightful domination. It is one of the clearest examples I know of how a myth can be broken without being forgotten. Helena Blavatsky played a central role in that shift. Her vast mystical constructions pulled together fragments from Hindu cosmology, esotericism, Western occultism, biblical speculation, and vague geology, then placed Hyperborea among the early root races of humanity. In her hands, the Old North became not only a lost place, but a stage in spiritual evolution. Even before later distortions intensified, something had already changed. Hyperborea was no longer simply a memory of environmental exile or sacred northern light. It had become a ladder. I think ladders are where myths begin to turn cruel. Once a story becomes a hierarchy, someone will always try to stand on the highest rung. That is exactly what happened in parts of Germany and Austria in the early 20th century. Writers like Guido von List and Lanz von Liebenfels stripped away the older, more fluid spiritual atmosphere and hardened Hyperborean fantasy into a racial genealogy. Light became purity. Purity became blood. Northern origin became a license for exclusion. The myth that once linked distant peoples through shared memory of a bright homeland was transformed into a weapon. That transformation remains one of the saddest episodes in the whole history of the legend, because it shows how easily longing can be turned into cruelty when it is forced to answer political hunger. The Thule society took that broken inheritance and amplified it further. Ancient northern names, runic glamour, solar symbolism, elite destiny, all of it pressed into ideological service. The old polar dream was now draped over resentment and ambition. Men gathered in rooms dense with smoke and certainty, speaking of lost origins and future rule, as though myth itself could absolve them of what they wanted to do to the living. I have always found those scenes almost unbearable, not because they are theatrical, but because they are so familiar. Human beings keep doing this. We inherit a symbol of renewal, then flatten it into a badge of superiority. The AI tracing work showed something chilling. The language of these later writers repeatedly detached Hyperborea from climate, migration, and shared human memory, then attached it to inheritance, rank, and exclusion. In other words, the myth stopped looking backward toward a lost world and started looking downward at other people. That was the corruption. Explorers and occult enthusiasts of the same period added yet another layer. Phantom islands, polar openings, hollow earth fantasies, secret northern refuges hidden inside the globe. Once straightforward discovery failed to produce a visible Hyperborea, the legend retreated into conspiracy. That often happens when desire outruns evidence. The failure to find something does not end the dream. It drives the dream deeper into unfalsifiable space. And yet history, patient as ever, eventually reclaimed the ground. After the worst ideological distortions burned through the 20th century, serious archaeology, paleoclimatology, genetics, and Arctic geology slowly returned the northern question to a more honest frame. Not, was there a master race in a hidden polar kingdom? Not, where is the secret entrance? But, what kind of world did the Arctic actually once support? What did ancient people remember? How much truth can survive inside myth without remaining literal in every detail? This is where the story becomes calm again. The ice remains a better witness than ideology. Deep-sea drilling, seismic surveys, satellite radar, ice-penetrating imaging, and permafrost DNA studies now reveal a North that has changed repeatedly, sometimes abruptly. Beneath the Arctic Ocean lie drowned shelves and continental ridges. Beneath Greenland lie ancient river valleys. Beneath the permafrost lie old ecosystems, traces of forests, wetlands, animal corridors, and habitable windows that would once have made northern life possible on a much larger scale than earlier scholars admitted. AI-based synthesis has been especially useful in combining these scattered data sets into landscape reconstructions, not fantasies, but probabilistic worlds. Cold, then open, then drowned, then sealed, then thawing again. That final phrase matters now more than ever. Thawing again. In the last years, Greenland ice core analysis found preserved vegetation beneath the ice, evidence that the island was at times much less frozen than the modern eye assumes. Ancient DNA from Siberian permafrost revealed entire ecological communities. Pollen cores recovered from Arctic ridges and shelves confirmed that temperate vegetation once reached astonishing latitudes during warmer phases. None of this proves the Hyperboreans of Greek poetry walked exactly where those plants once grew. But it does something nearly as important. It tells us the old stories were not climatically absurd. A living north was real. And once that admission is made, the old legend begins to sound different in the room. Not childish, not solved, just different, more human, more plausible in its emotional outline. The Greeks said There was a land beyond Boreas, touched by enduring light. The climate record says there were northern windows when light fell on living ground that is now frozen or drowned. The myths of many peoples remembered a bright homeland lost to cold. Archaeology confirms repeated northern habitation and migration under conditions that later generations would barely believe. Ancient builders obsessed over circular light, fixed north, the pole, and the returning sun. Geology shows that the northern world repeatedly opened and vanished in forms dramatic enough to scar memory. Piece by piece. The modern evidence does not verify Hyperborea as a neat capital city. It does something subtler. It restores dignity to the possibility that the myth held real memory. That, I think, is enough to be astonished by. The source tradition you gave me ends by returning to the earth, speaking again through thaw. That is exactly the right ending. Every summer, more of the Old North emerges. Mammoth remains erode from coastal cliffs. Ancient soils darken in the light after tens of thousands of years hidden below frost. Buried ecosystems declare themselves through DNA alone. What scientists call thawing ground can feel, in a much older language, like remembrance. You can almost sense the irony. For centuries, the modern world prided itself on being more rational than the ancients. We dismissed the northern paradise as decorative exaggeration. We rolled our eyes at drowned lands and long memory. Then the ice began to retreat, and the earth started handing back clues that sounded uncomfortably close to the old songs. Not proof of every golden detail. No. The world is rarely so theatrical, but enough to remind us that ancient people were not fools for preserving what they could not fully verify. There is another darker note here. One, the story should not avoid. The same warming that helps us glimpse the Old North is also a warning of our own instability. Hyperborea, in that sense, is not only about the past. It is about the fragility of habitable worlds. The myths remember paradise lost beneath cold. We now live in an age where worlds may be lost beneath heat. Sea rise, ecological unraveling, and the speed of change itself. The old stories return at exactly the moment we have become capable of understanding their environmental underside. That gives the whole legend a different moral weight. Hyperborea is no longer only an argument about whether a hidden civilization once stood beneath the north wind. It becomes a meditation on how human beings remember stability after it fails. A land of balance disappears. Survivors move. They carry songs. Over time, the songs become impossible to map, but impossible to forget. Then, ages later, science arrives and discovers that the songs were not empty after all. They were compressed truth. I like that phrase very much. Compressed truth. It feels right for myth at its best. Not literal enough to satisfy the bureaucrat of evidence. Not false enough to deserve dismissal. A density of memory. A shape preserved when the details are gone. If you sit with the story long enough, that is where it settles. Hyperborea was probably not one clean empire of marble under the polar sun. It may have been something more elusive and more profound. A recurring habitable north, a chain of landscapes at the top of the world that opened during warmer ages and vanished under ice and sea. A source of migration, a source of symbolic attention, a source of memories so charged with light and loss that civilizations carried them for millennia, even after the map no longer matched the song. The fireplace is low now. The room has gone very quiet. The north wind in the mind is no longer violent. It is steady. It moves over drowned shelves, ancient river valleys, long summer light, circles of stone, and stories told by people who had already lost what they were describing. I think that is why Hyperborea still matters. It is not just a legend about something hidden. It is a legend about how deeply the human mind can remember a changed Earth. Outside this room, satellites still pass over Greenland. Cores are still drilled. Sediments are still red. Ancient DNA is still being coaxed from frozen dirt. AI systems still compare patterns too large for one scholar to hold at once. And beneath all that machinery, the same quiet possibility remains. The ancients may have been listening to the land more carefully than we gave them credit for. They may have preserved not a fantasy of perfection, but the echo of a real northern world, luminous, habitable, and gone. So the story ends where it began, beyond Boreas, beyond the last ordinary wind, where the map once turned white and the Greeks kept drawing light into the blank. We have followed that light through poetry, maps, climate, migration, stars, symbols, distortion, and thawing ground, and it has never completely gone out. Not on the page, not in the ice, not in us. If Hyperborea ever existed, perhaps it exists still, in the only way lost worlds truly can, as memory returning in layers, in pollen, in story, in architecture, in DNA, in the patient speech of the earth as it thaws and offers back what it was forced to hide. The Old North may never rise as a city, but it has already risen as a truth about human history, that our ancestors once lived closer to a brighter edge of the world than we believed, and that they loved it enough to carry its image through catastrophe and into myth. Good night.